Excellent.
There we go.
Okay, so tell me when we're
Ready.
good. Okay, all right, we're ready. Okay, so welcome to the Brooklyn College Philosophy Department's annual lecture, the Sprague and Taylor Lecture, which is being given this year by Professor David Chalmers from NYU. I'm Sam Trivedi, the current chairperson of the department. Let me begin by saying something about this lecture itself. We've held this annual lecture in our department at least since 1950. In 1997, the lecture was renamed the Sprague and Taylor Lecture in honor of two of our professors, Elmer Sprague and Paul Taylor, who both taught here for about 40 years each. Both retired before I joined the department, though I met Elmer Sprague at least a couple of times at these lectures. Paul Taylor passed away in 2015, and Elmer Sprague more recently in 2019. Over the years, we've had many distinguished philosophers deliver this lecture. It'll take me a long time to read all the names, and I'm sure you want to hear soon from Professor Chalmers anyway. But some recent speakers include the late Charles Mills, Virginia Held, Catherine Wilson, Ronald D'Souza, Kate Elgin, Jason Stanley, Dean Zimmerman, and Michelle Moody Adams just last year. We've also had speakers who are either Australian or spent a lot of time in Australia. This includes Peter Singer, Philip Pettit, and Michael Devitt. We've also had philosophers from NYU, including Anthony Appia many years back, Don Garrett, and Miranda Fricker, who will leave CUNY, our loss, and join NYU this fall. And that brings me to Professor Chalmers. David Chalmers grew up in Australia, where I understand he was something of a math whiz growing up. After studying math, or maths as they call it there, at universities in Australia and England, he came to the US as a graduate student and got his PhD in philosophy and cognitive science at Indiana University Bloomington. He is a university professor of philosophy and neuroscience at NYU, the co-director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness, and honorary professor of philosophy at the Australian National University. Professor Chalmers has written and edited many books and articles, including his very influential book, The Conscious Mind. We're going to hear today about zombies, I understand. His most recent book is Reality Plus, published earlier this year by Norton. The title of his lecture today is Sentience and Moral Status. So he will give a talk, we'll take a quick 2-minute break, and then we'll resume with Q&A. That's the plan, okay? So please join me. Let's welcome Professor David Chalmers.
Well, thank you so much, Sam. And thanks to all of you for coming. It's a real honor and privilege to be giving this Sprague and Taylor lecture today. And I'm delighted to hear about this long list of extremely remarkable predecessors. I'll hope to do my best to continue the Australian thread and the NYU thread and so on. I had my setup here is I had a microphone which is not actually turns out not to be working, so I'm just using the internal microphone on the Mac. Let me know if there ends up being any audio issue. Hopefully it'll be okay. Yeah, I'm sorry I can't be there in person with the pandemic and all. I do hope to make it out to. I live just one borough away in Manhattan. I hope to be able to make it out to Brooklyn College sometime before too long to see a number of you in person. My topic today is sentience and moral status. This is a subject which is at the intersection between one field I know very well and one field I know much less well. The field I know well is the philosophy of mind. And I take it that sentience is at least primarily a notion from the philosophy of mind. Sentience at least is very closely tied to consciousness, a topic I've thought about a fair amount. The other notion, moral status, is a notion tied to ethics, an area I know much less well. I've done very little work in ethics and value theory over my career. Nonetheless, it's come to seem to me that there are very deep links between these topics. I don't know whether it's just the phenomenon that, once you think about something enough, it feels like a hammer for which everything is a nail. So consciousness here is my hammer, and ethics is the relevant nail. But nonetheless, it's come to seem to me, as it has to quite a few others, that there are deep connections between consciousness and ethics and value. And some of those I'm going to try to explore today. Let me now share my screen to give you the slides. Okay. Let me get this on the full screen. Okay. Hopefully that's now coming through. So I'll start with moral status. We say a being has moral status roughly if it matters in moral decisions for its own sake. And standardly we say that humans certainly have moral status. Most people would say dogs have moral status, but most people would say that coffee cups do not have moral status. Maybe coffee cups are relevant morally. You don't go breaking other people's coffee cups for no reasons. But then it's not because so much of the moral status of the coffee cup in its own right, but say for the status of, say, the humans that are interested in the coffee cup. So yeah, coffee cups don't seem to matter in moral decisions for their own sake, but most people would say humans, and most non-human animals do. There's also a decision to be made between full and partial moral status. A being has full moral status if it matters in moral decisions for its own sake as much as ordinary humans do. For example, in the Black Lives Matter movement, it's this kind of moral status which is at issue. When we say Black Lives Matter, we're saying Black Lives Matter as much as any human life does. There's also a relevant kind of moral status, which is partial moral status, which is to say a being matters in moral decision to some extent, to any extent, perhaps not as much as humans do. So, for example, in the animal rights movement, I think it's common to say, okay, maybe animals, non-human animals, don't have the moral status that humans do, but nevertheless they have some moral status. They matter in moral decisions for their own sake to at least some extent. And we'll be talking about both full and partial moral status today. Once you raise this question of moral status, questions immediately arise. Which beings have moral status? In virtue of what does a being have moral status? And for me, I'm especially interested in what is the relationship between consciousness and moral status. Many people have thought there's some tie between moral status and consciousness. But just what is that tie? That's what I'll be looking at today. So there's a view out there which is increasingly common, and I think increasingly widely held, has a long history, but very popular today, which often goes by the name Sentientism, that says a being has moral status if and only that being is sentient. And the question is, what is sentience? And here there's actually a couple of different readings, but it's at least got something to do with consciousness. Here's one motivation for sentientism. It's sometimes presented as a successor to the view of humanism, but one which is more inclusive. I mean, humanism, I think, was originally thought to be put forward as a fairly inclusive view of moral status because it includes all humans, and it doesn't necessarily ground moral status in say God or in a religion or something supernatural. But people came to think that humanism, that being the view that all humans have moral status, and moral status is deeply tied to humanity, is not really sufficiently inclusive. It potentially leaves out many beings, perhaps most obviously non-human animals, as depicted here by a pig, which presumably has some moral status. Also, though, the possibility of robots or artificially intelligent creatures that many people think in principle could have moral status. Maybe the ones we have right now don't, but in principle they could. Or maybe even aliens. Just say we discover extraterrestrial beings, Martians, as it were, it seems that they could in principle have moral status. So we need something more inclusive than humanity. And the thought is that sentience might be the common factor that gives all of these beings moral status. Here's Richard Ryder, the animal rights activist who coined the term sentientism back around 1990. He also coined the term speciesism, so quite an influential linguistic and conceptual engineer. He says consciousness is of paramount importance to all of us. By definition, it is the universe of our awareness. On the assumption that many other species are conscious or sentient, I have suggested that our morality is based on a concern for all sentience, which I have called sentientism. So he says I could equally have called it consciousism. And then he says that's even more horrible as a word. And then he says pain and pleasure are the two great poles of consciousness between which all sentience swing, striving to gain one, to gain pleasure, and to avoid pain. So there we see very clear and tight link tied between sentientism and consciousness. It's at least very close to the view that moral status, having moral status is tied to being conscious. But there's also a somewhat narrower claim being made about tying moral status specifically to pain and pleasure, which I take to be conscious states, but then they're a very specific kind of conscious state. So already there, we get two kinds of sentientism at play, one tied to consciousness in general, one potentially tied to pleasure and pain. So around here, I find it useful to distinguish between two kinds of sentientism, which I'll call consciousness sentientism and affect sentientism. Consciousness sentientism says a being has moral status if and only if it has the capacity for phenomenal consciousness. I'll say what phenomenal consciousness is in a moment. Affect sentientism says a being has moral status if and only if it has the capacity for affective phenomenal consciousness, which is a more restricted kind of consciousness, tied to things like pain and pleasure. Both of these also come in, each of these theses comes in multiple varieties, depending on whether you go for the if and only if thesis or the only if thesis. I'll actually be most concerned with the only if thesis, but the if and only if thesis will also come up as well at various points. So what is phenomenal consciousness? Phenomenal consciousness is the kind of consciousness that that many philosophers are interested in, the kind that I've spent much of my life thinking about, very deeply tied to subjective experience. One famous slogan is that a being is conscious in the sense, phenomenally conscious, if there's something it is like to be that being. So back in 1974, my NYU colleague, Tom Nagel, wrote a famous article called "What is it like to be a bat?" And the thought is, okay, well, we don't know what it's like to be a bat, but presumably there's something it's like to be a bat. A bat has some kind of subjective experience when it's sending out sonar signals and processing them. If there's anything it's like to be a bat, and the bat has some subjective experience of its own, then we say the bat is phenomenally conscious. But there's presumably nothing it's like to be this coffee cup. There's nothing it's like to be a coffee cup, and the coffee cup is not phenomenally conscious. And most of the time I'll just say conscious instead of phenomenally conscious. But phenomenal consciousness is a philosopher's word that helps distinguish this from other notions of consciousness. We can also say that a mental state is phenomenally conscious if there's something it's like to be in that state. And yeah, conscious mental states include all these elements of the subjective inner movie, if you like: conscious perception, seeing and hearing things, conscious emotion, feeling things, conscious thought, thinking and deciding things, maybe conscious action. All of these can be states of subjective experience. Affective phenomenal consciousness, on the other hand, I take to be something somewhat narrower. Affective phenomenal consciousness involves conscious states with a positive or negative affective valence. So states with a positive valence include the experience of pleasure, satisfaction, happiness, all of which have some subjective experiential quality of a positive nature, while negatively valenced phenomenal conscious states include the experience of pain, of frustration, of suffering, and subjective experience with this somewhat negative character. I'm not going to try and analyze positive and negative valence further at this point. I take it the notion is fairly intuitive. What I call affect is basically, an affective state is any state with a positive or negative experiential valence. So I take it affective phenomenal consciousness is at least one very important kind of phenomenal consciousness. So the plan here is, so now we have two versions of sentientism: consciousness sentientism that ties moral status to consciousness, and affect sentientism that ties it to affective consciousness. I'm actually very sympathetic with the first view, consciousness sentientism. And I'm extremely unsympathetic with the second view, affect sentientism. Although it's been an extremely popular view in the literature among many people, I think there's a very strong case against it. So what I'm going to do in what follows is to offer thought experiments and analysis to explore each of these views. Somewhat less detail on consciousness sentientism. I'm going to make maybe a prima facie case for consciousness sentientism, but it'll be fairly inconclusive, but just getting the initial case for consciousness sentientism on the table. And then in more detail, I'm going to try and make a case against affect sentientism using thought experiments and arguments in each case. Okay, so consciousness sentientism. At some point I was calling this broad sentientism, broad and narrow, but I figure it's actually good philosophical thesis is don't use words like broad and narrow or strong and weak to modify your views when you can actually use some more informative words. So now I'm using consciousness and affect sentientism. So consciousness sentientism is a being has moral status only if it has the capacity for phenomenal consciousness, perhaps if and only if it has the capacity for phenomenal consciousness. We say here the capacity because, we're not all conscious all the time. We fall asleep and maybe when we're dreaming, we have some phenomenal consciousness, but arguably there are moments when we're not phenomenally conscious at all. We don't want to say at those moments we have no moral status. I think it would still not be okay for people to, to kill us for no reasons while we're sleeping. So instead we tie moral status to the capacity for phenomenal consciousness, which can be present in beings while they're, for example, sleeping. So here, to test this thesis, you might think, okay, well, the best way to think about this is to move to beings which are as much like human beings as possible, but they lack the capacity for phenomenal consciousness, and we'll investigate their moral status. And as it happens, that's something I've thought a little bit about in my career. Some mentioned the philosophical zombie. A philosophical zombie. Well, here this is what I found on the web. It's to defined here as something that seems like a normal human, but does not have conscious experience, sense experience, or qualia. All of the physical states, none of the mental states. Yeah, so a philosophical zombie is often understood as a being that's at least outwardly like a human being, behaves exactly like a human being, but has no phenomenal consciousness on the inside. And quite often, it's stipulated that even more strongly, a philosophical zombie might be physically identical to a human being, but lacks conscious experience entirely. For my own present purposes, it doesn't matter too much which of these conceptions we go for. Let's just make it a being which is as much like a human being as possible, but lacks phenomenal consciousness. And yeah, this is the philosopher's zombie. I mean, the picture here is not a good picture of a philosopher's zombie. This is much more like a Hollywood zombie. Of course, the Hollywood zombies don't behave very much like human beings at all. This one is behaving very distinctively. Doesn't look like a normal human to me. And who's to say whether Hollywood zombies are actually unconscious? Maybe it tastes like something for them when they eat their victims. Who knows? But yeah, philosophical zombies, behaviorally like humans, but no consciousness. And then the question arises: what is the moral status? Well, here is a depiction of philosophical zombies. This is for my recent book that Sam mentioned, Reality Plus, where I got 57 marvelous illustrations by an illustrator, Tim Peacock, who actually lives in Brooklyn. Yeah, 57. He was just marvelous, actually, at illustrating a number of philosophical thought experiments. So we'll use a few of his illustrations here today. But it came up: how should we depict a zombie, a philosophical zombie, in an illustration? And well, we wanted. So this is actually a picture of Commander Data for Star Trek, who at one point goes on trial to see if he's allowed to be. It's okay to dismantle him or not. And the question is, does he have moral status, basically? And it came down to, is Data actually conscious? And there are two hypotheses. Hypothesis one: he's conscious. Here we see his consciousness depicted. He's seeing some people, perhaps feeling some things. He's got some thought going through his head. The other hypothesis is he's a zombie. There's nothing going through his head. The question came up: what's the best way actually to depict a zombie? Should it be no? And then we have this consciousness, but the conscious version has this consciousness bubble. Should zombie Data have no consciousness bubble, or an empty consciousness bubble? I don't know what you think. We had a long discussion of this. In the end, we decided that the empty consciousness bubble conveyed slightly more clearly the idea that Data is having no conscious experience. But you can make a case that really a better depiction of a zombie is this one. So the question came up: does this AI creature, is it conscious, or is he conscious, or is he just a zombie? And that was very relevant to the moral status of this being. Okay, so then the question is, how are we going to assess the moral status of zombies? And here I engage in a mashup with another famous philosophical thought experiment, the thought experiment of the trolley problem. I suspect that most of you know about the trolley problem already. It's made its way into many corners of popular culture, including The Good Place and other spots. The basic idea in the trolley problem is you have the choice of the trolley's going straight ahead. If it goes straight, it'll kill 5 people. You have the option to divert, to press the lever and divert it so it kills only 1 person. So this thought experiment was first put forward by the British philosopher Philippa Foot back, I think, in around 1967. It was then followed up by the American philosopher Judith Jarvis Thomson. Here we have an illustration of this is an illustration of Philippa Foot and Judith Jarvis Thomson at the wheel of the trolley, and having maybe some kind of argument, or at least some kind of very difficult decision about what to do, to let it go straight or divert it to kill 1 person. And there's a vast literature on this problem. But what I want to do today is not consider the original trolley problem, but but a variant of it, a mashup of the trolley problem with the philosophical zombie thought experiment. This will be one I call the zombie trolley problem. This is the best illustration I could find. These are not really philosophical zombies on the tracks, but some Hollywood-style zombies. But we're faced with the choice. One possibility is that the trolley kills one conscious being. The other possibility is that the trolley kills 5 philosophical zombies. So those 5 beings here are philosophical zombies. They look like humans from the outside, but they're philosophical zombies. So okay, track 1 has 1 conscious human in this thought experiment. Track 2 has 5 philosophical zombies, outwardly like a human being, but no conscious experience. And then you have the decision, should the trolley go down track 1 and kill 1 conscious being, or track 2 and kill 5 philosophical zombies? What should you choose? Okay, so take that situation and reflect on it for a moment. Think about what you would do there and what you think would be the right thing to do in this circumstance. I mean, people have different intuitions. But one very common intuition about this case, certainly not a universal intuition, there's a fair amount of variation here, but common, is that it's morally preferable to kill the 5 zombies. The thought is they're not conscious beings, so they matter less. They don't really have a point of view or a perspective on the world in lacking consciousness. Some people think they don't matter at all, but at the very least, many people think if they're not conscious beings, they matter less. Just so you do have that intuition, which I think is common, you can then we can then, to diagnose it a bit further, we can proceed to an extreme version. On track 1, we have 1 conscious chicken, and on track 2, we have a whole planet of humanoid zombies behaving intelligently and so on, but with no subjective experience. Then do you kill the chicken or the planet of zombies? What should you do? I mean, I find this one is a genuinely difficult choice. I mean, even if I'm inclined to think zombies don't have any moral status, it would make anyone hesitate before just choosing to kill a whole planet of humanoid zombies, not least because, hey, maybe we're wrong, maybe they have moral status. One thing we should be trying to do here is to separate intuitions about, well, these zombies might have value to us, or they might do valuable things. We're just trying to focus on their intrinsic moral status. I think some people at this point, I have heard people say, kill the zombies, save the chicken because the chicken is conscious. If that's your view, then it starts to look like non-conscious beings don't matter. It's always, or at least they're always trumped by consciousness. If you choose track 1, which I think is not totally unreasonable, kill the chicken, save the planet of zombies, then it starts to look like things besides consciousness might matter at least a bit. Maybe intelligence or intentionality or something like agency, if you think zombies have something like that. Anyway, I'm not going to try and settle that question here. I'll just ask these diagnostic questions. If, on the other hand, in the original thought experiment, you say, kill the 1 human, save the 5 zombies, we can then move to the parity version, which says on track 1, there's 1 conscious being. On track 2, there's 1 philosophical zombie. What should you do? I don't know. I think at this point, I think a lot of people say, well, in this case, okay, save the conscious being, kill the zombie. After all, the conscious being is conscious. And if that's your view, then it looks like consciousness matters at least a bit. If, on the other hand, you say, I don't know, one or the other, it's all the same to me, then it starts to look like consciousness doesn't matter at all. I haven't encountered that view, but it's an unusual one in these discussions. For what it's worth, my own verdicts in the parity case, very strongly inclined to save the conscious being, kill the zombie. In the 5-to-1 case, still pretty strongly inclined to save the conscious being. It's conscious after all. In the extreme case, the chicken versus the planet of zombies, I don't know, I find that a very difficult case. There's at least, some intuitions that zombies, although even if they matter less than conscious humans, they've got possibly some kind of moral status. And, at least to the point where it doesn't feel quite right to disregard them entirely. But I think, people differ on this one. And I'm not going to try and settle that case here, just making a prima facie case for consciousness mattering at least a bit, maybe a lot, in moral status. So upshot of those intuitions, at least, is that consciousness matters a lot in moral decisions. It may or may not be absolutely required for moral status. It certainly seems to have a huge effect on moral status. There's an intuitive case for consciousness sentientism. That is, zombies don't matter, but it's not cut and dried. It could be that features beyond phenomenal consciousness, like maybe intentionality or agency, matter a bit, features which arguably a zombie could have. Okay, so that's enough for now then on consciousness sentientism. Let me now talk about affect sentientism, which says a being has moral status if and only if it has the capacity for effective phenomenal consciousness. And as before, I'm going to focus especially on the only if claim, that to have moral status, you have to have affective phenomenal consciousness. I mean, to test this claim by analogy to the way we tested consciousness sentientism, we want to consider beings which are as much like human beings as possible, but they lack affective phenomenal consciousness. For that, it's not quite the zombie case that we need. Instead, it's a related thought experiment. Here, here I'll just say something about the historical roots of this view. Way back in 1789, Jeremy Bentham advocated affect sentientism, saying, in talking about non-human animals' moral status, the question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? Saying suffering is what matters for moral status, and suffering is quite clearly a kind of affective phenomenal consciousness. You also find this view in Peter Singer. Here he is in Animal Liberation in 1975, where he says, the capacity for suffering and for enjoying things is a prerequisite for having interests at all. A stone doesn't have interest because it can't suffer. Nothing we can do to it could possibly make a difference to its welfare. A mouse, on the other hand, does have an interest in not being tormented because it will suffer if it is. This is why the limit of sentience, where he says using the term as a convenient shorthand for the capacity to suffer or experience enjoyment or happiness, is the only defensible boundary of concern for the interests of others. I think it's a pretty clear statement of affect sentientism in 1975, saying, suffering or experiencing enjoyment or happiness, affective states, the boundary of concern for the interests of others. Okay, so now I'm going to get to the thought experiment of being which is as much like human beings as possible, but lacks affect. Here, it's not quite a full-scale philosophical zombie. Instead, it will be a being I call a philosophical Vulcan. A philosophical Vulcan is a hypothetical being that is phenomenally conscious, but lacks the capacity for affective consciousness. And philosophical Vulcans, of course, are inspired by the Vulcans in Star Trek. Here is Mr. Spock in the original TV series. There have subsequently been many Vulcans and different versions and reboots of Star Trek. But I think Mr. Spock is still the most famous. Now, it should be said that Spock is not a perfect example of a philosophical Vulcan. For a start, he's in the TV series, he's got one Vulcan parent, but one human parent, so half human, which presumably gets him more affect coming in. Furthermore, the Vulcans in the TV series have these extreme states of pon farr, I think it is, every 4 or 5 years, where they experience extreme lust and many emotions and so on. So Vulcans are not perfect examples of philosophical Vulcans, but the philosophical Vulcan is stipulated to be somewhat more extreme. It's a conscious being, but it lacks affective states entirely. The way I'm thinking about it, Vulcans still perceive, think, and act. There's still something it's like to be them, but they don't experience pain, pleasure, happiness, or suffering. All of their conscious states are affectively neutral, neither positive nor negative. And I think we've all had affectively neutral conscious states. You know, a lot of the conscious states I have in an average day are affectively neutral. For a Vulcan, that's how it is all the time. Some existing disorders are already a little bit like, you know, in the direction of philosophical Vulcans. Some existing disorders involve diminishment or elimination of affect. I mean, there's a phenomenon sometimes called pain asymbolia, where subjects say, okay, well, I can feel the pain here, but it's not hurting me. Which is arguably a kind of reduction of affect. There's also what's sometimes called anhedonia, the inability to experience pleasure, which involves the diminishment, at least, or perhaps the elimination of certain forms of positive affect. And there are often news stories about people who don't seem to be able to experience affect of one kind or another. I don't know if there's any actual case as extreme as a Vulcan. I suspect every human being has some affective consciousness. But Vulcans you can think of as being stipulated to have extreme asymbolia and anhedonia for all affective phenomena. Their conscious states are neutral. Now, Vulcans, unlike zombies, Vulcans needn't be functional or behavioral duplicates of ordinary humans, but they won't be motivated by pleasure. They won't, as I'm thinking of them, display emotional reactions. They're probably not going to, go to restaurants for the pleasure that the fine food will bring them, because they won't get any such pleasure. And in general, presumably they'll be less motivated by sensory pleasures in general. But the way I'm thinking about them, they're still motivated. They still have goals and projects. Vulcans may still be interested in advancing science, helping those around them. They may have some self-interest. Maybe they even have families at them, whose lives they try to make better. I'll talk a bit in what follows about to what extent that's possible without affect. So I think few of us would choose to become Vulcans. I mean, to lose the capacity for affect would be a very major diminishment of our conscious lives. Vulcans seem to live in impoverished conscious lives compared to our own. But still, the question arises, do they have moral status? Because if you're an affective sentientist, you'll say that Vulcans do not have moral status. So here we can test that, I suppose, with the Vulcan trolley problem. Here we have a trolley case with one conscious being on one track, 5 philosophical Vulcans on the other track, here depicted by these 5 Vulcans with the pointy Vulcan ears and a rather stoic expression on their faces. Well, here is Jeremy Bentham, who's actually at the helm of this trolley, because Bentham said the question is, do they suffer? Well, if Vulcans don't suffer, then presumably Bentham says, okay, we should kill the Vulcans, save the conscious being. I don't know. So on track 1, 1 conscious being. On track 2, 5 philosophical Vulcans, conscious but not experiencing affect. What should you do? Okay, think about that one for a moment. Or here's an extreme version. Suppose you can save an hour's drive on your commute home by killing a Vulcan. Is that permissible? Would that be an okay thing to do? I don't know. I have a very clear verdict about these cases myself. My strong reaction is one should not kill 5 Vulcans to save a human. And in the second case, it would be absolutely monstrous to kill a Vulcan to save an hour's travel. Vulcans are conscious beings. Their lives matter. It just seems crazy to me to imagine just because these Vulcans lack affective conscious states, their lives don't matter. They're still conscious beings. To some extent, that's an intuition. I think it's a very strong one, at least for me. If you want to kind of get into an argument, turning this intuition into an argument, one way to do it is think about some kind of slippery slope argument. Let's consider beings who have some positive and negative valence, but just a tiny positive negative positive and negative valence. I mean, we all know people with narrow affective ranges. Let's take a being with a very narrow but non-zero affective range. So how much do their lives matter in moral decisions? Two possibilities seem natural. Either they matter about as much as humans do. But then it seems kind of bizarre that just a tiny difference from Vulcans, just very tiny affective states, make a vast moral difference from not mattering to mattering a lot. Or we can say these beings matter about a fraction as much as ordinary humans do, which would be another natural slippery slope view. Then it starts to look like just people with wide affective range matter a whole lot more in moral decisions than people with narrow affective range, which I don't know, to me is counterintuitive and again, maybe a little bit monstrous. I mean, many actual people have much wider affective ranges than others. It seems bizarre to me to think those beings with wide affective range somehow count for 2 or 3 times as much as beings with a narrower affective range. Okay, so those are some intuitions. My intuitions is that, is that Vulcans matter in moral decisions. And if that's right, that means that, it's not just affective consciousness that matters, but maybe consciousness more generally. Okay, there's various things people could say in response to object to my argument against affective sentientism. One thing people might say, a fairly common reaction among affect sentientists is that maybe Vulcans matter, but only in a limited way. They matter only in the way, say, that forests matter. Many people think that, okay, some non-conscious entities can matter. Trees, forests, plants, the earth can matter even though they're not conscious. It's a special way of mattering. Forests can be beautiful and complex. They don't have perspectives of their own, but they still somehow matter in a morally, for their own sake, in a certain way. It would be monstrous in a certain respects to destroy a forest, even if no human was affected. My response to that is maybe there is this distinctive way of mattering that non-conscious beings can have, but after making the distinction between ways of mattering, my intuition is very much that Vulcans matter the way that humans matter, for their own sake, from their own perspective, not just the way that forests matter. I think that's a very strong intuition about this case. Vulcans deserve the same kind of moral respect that humans get. The second objection is that Vulcans are perhaps inconceivable or impossible because non-affective conscious states are entirely impossible. The view is out there that consciousness runs so deep that every conscious state involves positive or negative affect. I don't know, I find this view pre-theoretically implausible because it's true that, some of our ordinary perception and thought is strongly affective with affective elements, but quite a lot of it seems to be at best weakly affective, insignificantly affective. And pre-theoretically, in the course of a normal day, I have a lot of affectively neutral perceptual or cognitive states, not tied to significant positive or negative affect. Furthermore, in most theoretical models of affect, valence is represented as a parameter which can be positive and negative. And in most models, there's a neutral point. Normally, when you have positive and negative values, you also have a zero value. And this is the case where I think the theory fits the phenomenology. It seems both pre-theoretically and theoretically coherent for there to be a being whose affective states are all at the 0 point. That would be a Vulcan. The third objection, maybe the one that runs deepest, is that if Vulcans truly lack affect, then they're going to lack other mental properties, which are crucial for moral status. Maybe the most natural thing to invoke here is desire. Say Vulcans can't really want anything. They can't really desire anything because affect is required for desires. Then you might say, because of that, if Vulcans don't really want anything, then they don't really have interests at all, and they don't matter. You could also do this for Maybe you say Vulcans lack motivation, or they lack values, or they lack reasons, because you need affect for those things. But I'll focus especially on desires to start with. One view of desire is that desire requires feelings of pleasure or satisfaction upon achieving the desire, upon getting the thing that you want, or maybe upon anticipating it. There are actually affective theories of desire that say that what it is to want something is to have certain kinds of affect upon achieving or anticipating the object. Vulcans won't have that. Without that, someone can say a Vulcan lacks desires entirely. I don't know. I think I want to say that Vulcans, at the very least, have motivation. They have clear motivation to pursue science or to help others, and they sure seem to have goals. It looks like they're motivated to perform actions when they think this will achieve certain outcomes. So this is the standard functional profile for desires as philosophers think about it. Something, goals which interact with your beliefs in a certain way to produce actions in the right circumstance when you believe they'll achieve the desired outcomes. So it seems on a fairly standard functional picture of desires, Vulcans will have desires here. There is a question about whether motivation requires affect. Someone could push this a bit further and say Vulcans won't even truly be motivated without affect. Of course, you need affect for motivation at all. So on this reply, Vulcans could not be motivated. Maybe they couldn't even act without affect. There's a picture that goes back to, certainly at least to David Hume, that says, motivation requires, Hume said that motivation required what he calls passions. And sometimes passions here are just understood as desires. And then it comes down to be motivated, you need desires. But there's a stronger reading of the view that says passions actually involve some kind of affect, some kind of positive emotional valence, and motivation requires that. Hume's own view, I take it, is complicated. He did talk at some point about the cold passions, which start to look like desires without affect. But in any case, I think my own view is that although it's certainly true that affect is often a source of motivation, it does look like an awful lot of what we do doesn't seem to be grounded in affect. There are things that we want that aren't particularly tied to affect and that nevertheless motivate our actions. Furthermore, if you look at contemporary neuroscience, there's a contemporary neuroscience of affect that standardly distinguishes wanting, which is motivation, from liking, which is affect, and holds they're actually separate neural circuits for both. You can be motivated to pursue something, you can actually like it, you can get affect upon getting it, and these are actually distinct properties in standard neuroscience. So I think it's a fairly orthodox view that motivation does not require affect, so Vulcans are still coherent. There's also a question about whether does valuing require affect? You might say, okay, Vulcans act and are motivated, but they don't care about anything. They don't value anything. I don't know. Again, I'd say Vulcans at least say they value certain things. They sure seem to be pursuing those things because they take those things to be important. They live their lives accordingly. And then the question comes up, should we disbelieve them? I'd say that we should take this at face value. I think to step back from this for a moment, I guess I do think there are some ties, some deep ties between affect and desires. Some desires are grounded in affect. We might call these Humean desires, or affective desires, which are those grounded in affect, goals that we pursue because of associated pleasure, things we avoid because of associated pain, and so on. So those are desires grounded in affect. But there are also what we might call Kantian or non-affective desires, those not grounded in affect, but just, for example, in a judgment that certain outcomes are good. And here the thought is that just as Hume puts a lot of emphasis on affect, Kant seems to put much less emphasis on affect and more emphasis on reason in thinking about motivation. Although I think, this is still also a caricature of Kant's view, just as it's a caricature of Hume's view. But you might think of a Kantian creature as one that makes certain judgments. Yes, that would be good. Advancing science would be good. Therefore, I will do that without any affect tied to this. The philosopher Melinda Vedas has a very nice paper on affect and affective and non-affective desires from 1984. And since then, quite a few philosophers have written about this here and there. Chris Heathwood, Ruth Chang, and some others. This is actually a fairly standard distinction by now. I'm inclined to say then, okay, well, Vulcans may lack Humean desires, those grounded in affect, but they still have Kantian desires, those grounded in, for example, evaluative judgments. In my view, Kantian desires are about as morally significant as Humean desires. Even if you insist that these are not genuine desires, call them schmazires or something, it still seems monstrous to me to kill a conscious being who has those Kantian desires. So maybe someone's going to say that only Humean desires matter morally, but it's just, it's unclear to me why that should be so. I mean, there's also some fallback views here. One fallback view is to accept my criticism of affect sentientism, but to go for a weaker view, motivational sentientism. My postdoc at NYU, Luke Roloffs, has been developing a version of this view, that at least motivation is required for moral status. And I don't know, I find that more plausible than that affect is required for moral status. One possible counterexample is what Galen Strawson calls a weather watcher, a being that just sits there and consciously watches the weather and thinks, but doesn't act or desire anything. It's a purely passive being that takes things in. Would it be okay to kill a weather watcher? I don't know. My own view is that weather watchers would have lives that matter too. It would be monstrous to kill them. If that's right, then lack of desire and motivation, even lack of desire and motivation doesn't preclude moral status. And I would then reject motivational sentientism too. But it is tricky. It's trickier as to whether this is actually possible. These cases, you might think even thinking requires some motivation to think. So, but there is an interesting issue of whether motivational sentientism could be a fallback. Maybe we can come back to in discussion. But okay, then the upshot of all this is that affect can certainly make lives better or worse. It's a huge factor in making lives better or worse. Happiness and suffering are huge determinants of how good our lives are. But I think it's not what makes lives matter in the first place. In my view, affectless Vulcans matter morally just about as much as affective humans. If that's right, phenomenal consciousness may be required for moral status. I think that's at least possible. But my view is that affective consciousness is certainly not required for moral status, and therefore this popular view of affective sentientism is just false. Okay, I think I'm just about done. I think I'm out of time. If I had more time, I would go on to explore the relationship between consciousness and value more generally, but since I don't have time to talk about this, I will leave it to you as a homework exercise. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll take a quick 2-minute break and then continue with Q&A. So let's come back in 2 minutes.
some. For the Q&A, a few of the students
Yep.
asked really good questions in the chat while Professor Chalmers was.
Yeah, maybe we'll begin with the student questions, okay? If that's all right with faculty, just hold off for maybe 10 minutes or so.
I was going to chime in and propose students get to go first in the queue.
That's what they do at NYU. When I was in grad school, the graduate students at NYU, I believe they protested. They told the faculty, look, you guys dominate all the talks. You don't let the graduate students talk. So then they changed things at NYU. They said, you know, let the students ask questions for the first, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever. Okay. Dave is back. Dave, we're going to begin with some student questions in chat. Is that okay?
Sure.
And let's give the students a say first, then we'll come to faculty later. Faculty can wait. All right, so let's see. I'm clicking on the chat here, and let's see. I see that. Hold on. Okay. Why is my chat? Daniel, do you want to help me out with this with the chat here?
Sure. I can read it. So,
yeah, sure, please.
David, while you were presenting, some students asked interesting questions, some of clarification and some a bit more substantive. Taskin Khan asked, would you know ahead of time that there are 5 philosophical zombies versus 1 human being before you make the decision?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think it's a totally reasonable point that in practice, if we are confronted with this situation, how would we know that these are in fact philosophical zombies? They would, after all, from the outside, look exactly like human beings. And yeah, I think it would probably be reasonable in any ordinary version of this scenario, even if you had some uncertainty about whether they're conscious or zombies, then okay, don't kill them or don't treat them differently. Yeah, here I guess it's a thought experiment, so I guess I get to stipulate it. And I guess I'm stipulating that somehow or other we know that these are philosophical zombies. Maybe someone has developed a theory of consciousness where we've now established what the basis of consciousness is. We know that blah, blah, blah process is required for consciousness, and these zombies don't have it. I mean, it's an interesting question in its own right. How could we know that theory is correct? But here, I guess I'm stipulating it for the purposes of making the arguments, of trying to remove the epistemological elements of uncertainty about whether they're conscious and just focus on the issue of whether they have moral status. But don't consider this practical advice for that very reason. In practice, I think if we're confronted by someone who looks and behaves like a human, we should in fact assume that they're conscious.
There were two related questions next. One by Dominic: can the zombies become conscious? And Kishon asked, do the zombies serve a conscious purpose?
Yeah, interesting. Can the zombies become conscious? The philosopher Charles Seward, in one of his books, wrote about the process of zombification, where conscious beings become zombies. They lose the capacity for consciousness. And he argued none of us would like to undergo zombification. That would seem like a terrible thing to do. One's life would lose meaning. So it is an interesting question. Could it happen in reverse? Could a zombie come to acquire consciousness? Is there some operation? I guess at some point in Star Trek, Data got an emotion chip that gave him the capacity for emotions. Could Data start out as conscious, but at some point we get unconscious, but at some point he gets a consciousness chip that makes him conscious? Again, if we discovered that some special process is the neural basis or the physical basis of consciousness, then I suppose there's going to be the question of, we could add that to a non-conscious, to a system that lacks it. Thereby zombies would become conscious. That then actually raises a very interesting question, because I said that what matters for moral status is having the capacity for consciousness. And you might say, well, if zombies can become conscious, then arguably zombies have the capacity for consciousness, and therefore they should have moral status. And around here, I think we get into very deep territory about what counts as a capacity. People can lose capacities they have, they can gain new capacities. Blind people without the capacity to see have sometimes acquired the capacity to see through operations. for example. And I guess I'd say that's probably what's going on with zombies. If it was possible for a zombie to become conscious, then that would best be understood as zombies acquiring the capacity for consciousness. Once they acquire that capacity, they would then have moral status. But yeah, no, it's a very good question. And do the zombies serve a conscious purpose? I mean, I would say, I guess not for them. The zombies themselves have no conscious purposes by definition, because they lack consciousness. They could serve purposes for other conscious beings. I don't know, in Black Mirror, there are these scenarios where people make uploaded versions, AI versions of themselves, and just to help out with it. I don't know, I think there was one, someone makes an AI uploaded version of themselves just to help prepare their breakfast in the morning or something monstrous. That looks pretty monstrous. You're creating these uploaded beings who are conscious, but just serving your own purposes. You might think if we knew they would be zombies, then it would be morally okay. Maybe we could create zombie duplicates of ourselves or zombies to serve our purposes. And if they're not conscious, then they're not going to suffer, and this is not going to be awful. I don't know. I think the morality of this could still very much be debated, but I guess this would be a case where zombies could serve the purposes of conscious beings, and therefore maybe one wouldn't want to kill them because one would at least lose those purposes. But here I guess I'm trying to focus on mattering morally in their own sake for their own purposes, and then yeah, zombies won't serve their own conscious purposes because I guess since they're not conscious, they don't have any conscious purposes.
Okay, and then one more. Actually, two related questions. Dominic asked, when you cited the forest, he said, to be fair, trees actually have their own language and effective responses. They communicate through fungal networks like an internet. I think like an internet. So do forests have moral status? And if so, is it murder to log?
Yeah, that's interesting. Maybe, yeah, I mean, forests are extremely impressive. And in general, I think the trend has been to see plants, trees, and so on as having rather impressive kinds of information processing that is, at least in some respects, reminiscent of cognitive properties. There's even a rather controversial journal out there called Plant Neurobiology. Controversial because there are no neurons in a plant, but the thought is maybe there are processes that are relevantly like cognitive or thinking processes, maybe relevantly like language and affect. I guess I'd say the trees, I mean, one question is whether trees are themselves conscious. Some people think this, and we did a survey in the Phil Papers survey of professional philosophers. 7% of professional philosophers actually accept that plants and trees may be conscious. If that's right, then by my lights, they could definitely have moral status here. But assuming that they're not actually conscious, then could they have some moral status without it in virtue of these responses? And then there wouldn't be, this would be like a functional analog of affect and language, but it didn't go through subjective experience. At this point, I'd be inclined to say, possibly they have this kind of second tier moral status that doesn't require consciousness. And I talked about that for forests and jungles. But I'd be inclined to say this wouldn't be full moral status, the kind of moral status that humans have, not least because they lack consciousness. And I don't know to what extent I'd want to say. I do think that, yeah, one needs to make very subtle distinctions between kinds of moral status here, the kinds that humans have, the kinds of other conscious animals have, the kinds that maybe some non-conscious creatures might have, like forests. And I'm open to forests and trees having something there. But I think if it's not conscious, it won't be the full kind that humans have.
Then Taskin asked a really interesting one. Would coma patients be considered philosophical zombies?
Yeah, that's actually very interesting. And I mean, there are so many different kinds of coma and post-coma patients. And the question often actually comes up, are they conscious. Some people have locked-in syndrome and can't communicate, but still seem to be conscious. Some beings don't seem to have the capacity for complex thought, but may still experience pain and suffering. If you've got any element of experience, even just a little bit of pain or pleasure or suffering or perception, then I'd say you're not a philosophical zombie. The other big difference between a coma patient and a philosophical zombie is that philosophical zombies are meant to behave very much like a normal human. Coma patients don't behave like a normal human. They're basically missing anything that looks like intentional, deliberate agency in their behavior. They can be awake and sometimes minimally responsive, but in a way that most people think is not consciousness. So I guess not exactly philosophical zombies, both because they may have some element of consciousness, and even if they don't, their behavior is very different from normal humans. But coma patients do, of course, raise these moral issues very deeply and immediately. What is the moral status of a coma patient? I think the standard view is, to the extent they have the capacity for consciousness, even if they're not conscious now, if they have the capacity to recover consciousness later, then they should be given very significant moral status. It's not okay just to turn off life support without reflection. Whereas if we establish that a coma patient has no capacity for consciousness, then I think they're never going to become conscious again. Then I think the standard view is that it may be more acceptable to turn off the life support. At least their moral status is in a different tier. But yeah, these are very difficult questions.
Omar, I guess, made a comment. Perhaps you can say a bit more if you feel inclined. Omar said, I'm interested in your question about whether those who have wider affective range are more valuable. Extroversion is more valued in our society. It was a comment. Just wonder if
yeah, that's interesting. I guess, I mean,
it's a less extreme case of, like, rather than looking at someone who's brain dead, but someone who has maybe like some mental health malady that limits their affective range. Are these people less valuable than other people?
I want to say very much no. I mean, there are people with narrow affective ranges than others, and some neurotypes seem to go along with less affect than others. And to me, it's just bizarre to say that because of this, they have less moral status. It's true that there are certain positive features of extroversion, just as there are positive features of introversion. And some people may value, say, extroversion in others more because that's the kind of person they want to interact with. Others will value introversion in others more. But I don't think of that so much as a matter of moral status. Maybe that's something more like instrumental status, how much they're valued by other people for various reasons. It's hard for me to see why that should somehow make an extroverted person's life matter more than an introverted person's. But if somebody wants to defend the view that somehow, we should actually value people with wider affective ranges more, because, I don't know, they get to contribute more positive utility to the world because of their states of extreme happiness, I'd be very interested to hear a defense of that view.
Okay. Seymour, I guess this is a question of perhaps summary or recap. So in the end, how does consciousness imply moral status?
How does consciousness imply moral status? Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't really get into that here. Why does consciousness imply moral status? I just tried to today make an intuitive claim that consciousness and moral status are closely tied. I didn't actually fully defend the claim that any conscious being has moral status. I mean, just say you think that consciousness is very widespread and worms have some tiny element of consciousness. Does it follow that worms have moral status? I don't know. I think being conscious at least seems to put them into the league. But somebody might defend the claim that it's possible, maybe only certain kinds of consciousness give you moral status. I rejected that for affective consciousness, but here's another one. Maybe if you have affective consciousness or cognitive consciousness, that gives you moral status, but mere perceptual or sensory consciousness doesn't. I don't know, I find that to be a hard question. But in any case, I think it's, the question of why and how consciousness is connected to moral status, I think that's kind of part of the homework assignment. I think a lot of it comes down to the connection between consciousness and value, whether, personal, I think that, it's fairly plausible, not obvious, but fairly plausible that a being has moral status if things can, if it undergoes states of value, if it can have, say, personal value in its life, if things can be better and worse for it in some strong sense. If you accept that, then the question is, what's the connection? What explains the connection between consciousness and value? And some people just find it kind of an intuitive, primitive, obvious that consciousness grounds all value, is the only source of value in the world. But you might try and push this further back and say, why and how does that work? I don't know. Consciousness somehow gives you a perspective. It gives you a world. It gives you a world of meaning. It allows acquaintance, I guess, with some form of reality, which for me are very plausible preconditions for having value. But I can't say I've got a really well-developed theoretical story about how it is exactly that consciousness grounds or implies moral status. I think this is very much a very interesting open question.
Okay, thank you. Vivian Lee asked, you argued that Kantian values are just as important. So what about utilitarian values? What would your stance be on the one conscience versus 5 zombies trolley question if the 5 zombies attribute more to the human race or to the universe in general than the one conscious human? I suppose if they contribute more happiness.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, the question, I guess, is how they contribute more. One way that you might think they contribute more is just by being super happy. Like, I don't think, okay, they're zombies, so they won't have subjective experiential states of happiness. So insofar as I'm sympathetic with utilitarianism, I'd probably go, as did the classical utilitarians, for some kind of, the question is what states have utility? And what is the source of utility? And the classic view, I guess, is pleasure has positive utility, pain has negative utility. I'd be inclined for something a little bit broader, which is conscious states are the fundamental sources of utility. Now, zombies won't have those, so they won't have states with utility per se. But that said, they could still contribute utility by, for example, enhancing the happiness or the conscious states of others. If the zombies are doing amazing things and building amazing things that make many people happy, I don't know, maybe we could have, let's do it with non-human animals. Maybe there could be some zombie dogs that, although not conscious, still serve as emotional support animals for many conscious humans, and thereby contribute a whole lot of positive utility that way. And I certainly agree that in principle, zombies could contribute a lot of positive utility of that form. And maybe if we're utilitarians, we'll then say, don't kill the zombies because of all the good they're doing in the world. I guess I would just at this point try to separate out the kind of moral status that comes from contributing good to others from the kind that comes from mattering for your own sake, the good that they themselves undergo. And I'd say that zombies, if they're not conscious, then arguably they don't have the kind of moral status for their own sake, but they could still have the kind of moral status that comes from affecting others. And certainly a utilitarian and other consequentialists might want to take that into account in moral decisions.
Okay, let's take some faculty questions next, and we'll come back to the student questions in chat and to Daniel to help me out. Let's see if Matt Lindauer and his son would like to raise a question.
Thanks very much. I had the nightmare of asking a question on parental leave where the baby starts crying as soon as Q&A begins. So we'll see how this goes. Thanks for bearing with me. I have a lot of questions. I guess one has to do with whether, so we can reject affect sentientism for a variety of reasons. Consciousness sentientism, I also felt some resistance toward for similar reasons to why I thought the Vulcans cannot be just treated any old way. And I do think just from like a methodological perspective, sometimes the trolley type questions can distort whether something has moral status because the stakes are really high, whereas moral status is just, the way you define it is very minimal. It's just mattering for its own sake for moral decisions. So it might be that I would never, for instance, trade a painting. I never trade a human life against, any number of great paintings, but that doesn't mean that those paintings don't matter at all in my moral decisions, or the environment matters not at all, right? So that's just passing kind of thing about like the setup, I guess. But then when I was thinking about the Vulcans, again, I was thinking about the fact that even if something is not capable of affect, it might be capable of being disrespected, that it can be the object of disrespectful attitudes. Like if you took a Vulcan's body and you used it as a golf club or something like that, but that's not the right way. This is a very Kantian kind of thought based in respect, right? That there's something kind of inappropriate about certain kinds of attitudes towards certain kinds of entities. And that would not only open us, that avenue would open us not only toward rejecting affect sentientism, but also rejecting consciousness sentientism, right? Because there's also perhaps plausibly like disrespectful attitudes that we could have to the natural environment if we just treated it as another thing, or maybe even a great painting if we just treated it as another thing. And again, independently of the value that these things have for human beings, just putting that to the side. So I was wondering if maybe one way to put the question is, do you get off the train at conscious sentientism, or do you think that the capacity to be the object of disrespectful attitudes might actually be another thing going beyond consciousness that would maybe not the sole thing that matters. I'm a pluralist, but maybe that's another thing that would matter, that would bring us beyond consciousness as a necessary condition. Thanks.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess what this moves toward is that there may be many different kinds of moral status, and just having one or two grades may be ultimately much too coarse-grained, and we want to make many distinctions. And around here, yeah, my expertise runs out. But I know that in the literature on moral status, many distinctions are made, and probably some of those I could avail myself of. Yeah, I don't want to necessarily say that consciousness matters for all kinds of moral status, not even for all kinds of intrinsic. I'm at least open to the idea that, as you say, that forests, plants, even if not conscious, may have some kind of moral status. I'm not totally sure. I mean, some days I'm moved by the view that their moral status derives from their importance to humans, but I can certainly get in the mood where I think, okay, yeah, they've got some kind of moral status. It wouldn't be okay just to destroy a forest for no reason, even if it never affected any human. I do think that's a very different kind of moral status from the kind that humans have, and maybe even very different from the kind that non-human animals have. But yeah, it could be an important kind. And maybe you could disrespect a forest by doing things like that. And yeah, and then your question about respect is certainly, if then the question is what's involved in respect. If it was that kind of moral status that, say, that forests might have, I'm certainly open to the idea that zombies could have at least the moral status, say, that forests and trees and so on have. Do they have more? Yeah, I mean, some people are going to, yeah, it does feel definitely very queasy making to think about disrespecting a zombie by using its body for just arbitrary reasons. Of course, that's somehow affected by the fact that zombies are so human-like in their appearance that it's hard to know exactly how much weight to give that. But yeah, but I'm certainly open to the idea there are multiple moral statuses here, and some of them may not require consciousness. I also take your point that when you're thinking about killing and so on, trolley cases and so on, this is a very high bar. We may be getting at very strong intuitions about, yeah, I mean, there's much more to mattering morally than whether it's okay to kill you, and whether it's okay to kill you may be tracking some very distinctive, I think a very important kind of moral status. But it may well be that if we're pluralist enough about moral status, we'll need to make more more distinctions. In general, I'm in favor of pluralism, so I ought to be committed to working through this and seeing if we can distinguish 5 or 6 different kinds of moral status. And so here are the ones that consciousness tracks. Here are the ones that affect tracks. I'd still be surprised if there's anything for which affect is required, but I suppose as a pluralist, I can't totally rule that out. So yeah, that's very much worth thinking about.
Great, thanks a lot.
Thanks for the comment.
Yeah. Let's see if Anna Gottlieb would like to go next.
Yeah, hi David, thank you. I find this really
Yeah.
deeply interesting and a little bit disturbing. And here's why it's disturbing. And I'm coming at this from the murky world of moral theory. So yeah. So is moral status something that one possesses, such as a zombie versus a non-zombie, or something in which one is allowed to participate or not? So for example, people in persistent vegetative states can be held in their moral status by others versus fully conscious homeless people who are not, right? So in other words, what do you think of the possibility that just as we can create moral persons and moral status, we can also create zombies? So it's not something that's a part of their nature that they possess or don't possess, but something that is created by the actions of others.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I guess I'm thinking initially, at least, of moral status of something which obtains, at least to a very large degree, independently of what other people think about your moral status. I mean, maybe I'm at least roughly assuming some kind of, one way to think about this is everything I've said is at least consistent with some kind of moral realism, where there are objective facts about moral status and which beings should be considered morally, regardless of what people actually think about this. That said, I'm not a meta-ethicist, so if we assume that kind of moral realism, I think then it's going to be natural to strongly distinguish moral status from something like beliefs about moral status. And yeah, people's beliefs about moral status will be extremely important practically and sociologically, but they won't be what matters morally. You know, that homeless person has moral status irrespective of what anybody thinks about that. Where things get more interesting and more complicated is perhaps if one is more of a moral anti-realist who holds that moral facts somehow derive on what people take to be the moral facts. They're somehow constructed by people's views. Then I suppose there will be some interaction between having moral status, between beings having moral status and people's taking that being to have moral status. I think this is very complex here because it's not just what we take to be the case instinctively or immediately, but what we take, many people will tie it to what we take to have moral status on some form of ideal reflection. And I'd certainly very much hope that even if people say in their everyday life in some automatic moment are inclined to say dismiss a homeless person's moral status, that's not something they would endorse on reflection. But it is true that if you're a moral status, there's at least going to be potential ties here between, yeah. But I still think most moral anti-realists are going to distinguish between, yeah, people believing that a certain moral fact obtains, people believing that, say, something is good or something is right or something has certain moral status and it's actually having that moral status. Now, different forms of moral anti-realism may draw tighter or weaker connections between that. But I guess if you assume moral realism, I think there's a strong distinction to be drawn here.
Okay.
The sociology of moral status is, of course, extremely interesting in its own right, and as is the sociology of morality.
Fletcher, you've been very patient. Sorry, you're muted. Fletcher, I think you're muted.
Am I still muted? Can you guys hear me?
I hear you.
You're
So
good now.
thank you again, David. That was wonderful. I wanted to note, well, firstly, just preliminarily, I couldn't help but notice that the capacity for phenomenal consciousness on this view, it would seem to have the logical consequence that students sleeping in my class have moral status. And I've been trying to, motivate exactly the opposite view. So I'm hoping there's a ceteris paribus clause in here. But
oh, by the way, anybody who doesn't have their camera on is actually a philosophical zombie.
Oh, fantastic. So returning to that notion, maybe to just reshift the metaphor here from like a trolley problem to Sophie's choice sort of situation, to go back to maybe our friend, the flatworm or something like this. Let's just assume for the moment that it's got some really bare bones or lack thereof bones, of phenomenal consciousness. And we've got one of these versus, let's say, something singular. And let's say it's a singular AI that is a philosophical zombie, but at some point, the sort of parity principle kicks in. Let's say that it's got some sort of metacognitive abilities that aren't, higher order conscious thoughts or anything like that. And, maybe it even thinks in Kantian terms and can adjust its moral views, et cetera. If there's one and only one of these, and let's say in those sort of terms, it's maybe got a dignity in Kant's terms rather than a price. It's not replaceable. I'm sort of wondering, what extent does fungibility enter into this? Because to me, it would seem a flatworm is a flatworm is a flatworm, right? Whereas this non-phenomenally conscious AI might have something of an intrinsic value, maybe just in virtue of parity.
I heard someone once say that dogs are fungible, but cats are not. I don't know if that's offensive to dog people. Yeah, fungibility is interesting here. I don't know if I've got really detailed thoughts about it, but the thought is somehow you get non-fungibility once, like your identity really matters. You matter in virtue of being this being. I mean, that's certainly how it works in some human relationships, right? If we've got someone we love, it's very often partly in virtue of their identity. And even if their twin is sort of qualitatively identical, then we care about this person as opposed to that person. And maybe, I don't know, I think some people probably could have that relationship with a flatworm. Okay, this is my flatworm. This is the one I've been hanging out with. I don't want to hang out with any flatworm. I want to hang out with this flatworm. I don't know. Maybe that's at the level of preference rather than morality. But yeah, then when it comes to your super duper AI, certainly if the AI is conscious, I think it could then matter for its identity as much as any human being does. Interesting question. Yeah, what if the AI
stipulatively, if it weren't, just to press you, just very sorry.
What's that?
Stipulatively, if it weren't conscious in any sense.
Yeah, okay, but if it's not conscious, then certainly I think it could matter to us. Non-conscious creatures could matter to us in that non-fungible way. Yeah, this is my robot, the one I grew up with. I don't want the other robot. I want this robot. And I guess even kids have this often fairly deeply built in. That wouldn't be a matter of mattering for them. That would be mattering for us non-fungibly. But yeah, could the zombie, there's also a matter of mattering morally non-fungibly. I guess I'd need to really pin down that notion, mattering morally in virtue of your identity. I guess I'm a little bit inclined to think that qualitatively identical beings matter morally to the same extent, and are therefore, at least, I don't know if that means they're morally fungible or there's some different word we should use here. But yeah, I think even before getting to fungibility, then the question is, could these zombie AIs just matter morally if they have sophisticated enough metacognitive processes and so on? Yeah, well, my initial intuition is if they're not conscious, they don't have full-scale moral status. So maybe that the more remarkable they are, the more they have, say, that kind of moral status. I don't know, we said that forests have, but maybe in spades, because they're so remarkable, more remarkable than any forest. And then I suppose we'll get to questions of whether forests are themselves fungible and so on. And that gets to be beyond my pay grade.
Thanks. Just one thought just to follow up. So if it were something like a forest, I suppose, there's other trees can grow, like in Everest, I suppose, or something like that. Is that the idea?
Say it about Everest again.
Well, just insofar as there's inherently one and only one, right? And here's something that, again, you might say doesn't purely have an instrumental value. I know there are a lot of people that would say, qua part of nature as something just irreplaceable and utterly distinct in and of itself. Does that have a non-instrumental inherent value?
Yeah, I guess I'm inclined to think that mountains might, again, I'm unsettled in my view on the moral status of mountains. I think it's probably analogous in many respects to the moral status of forests, although I guess the issues about life maybe somewhat different. Then the question is, are they of value simply because of their value to us, or do they have some kind of mind independent, human independent moral value? And I'm certainly not totally opposed to the idea that they have some, although again, I'd say that that's something much weaker and different from the kind of moral status that that conscious humans have. But it may well be that, you get some kind of non-fungibility in that domain as well.
Alex, did you have a question? Your hand was raised a little while back. Oh, no. Okay. Matt, you want to raise another question? Your hand is raised still. Okay.
I'll let someone else do it.
Okay. Are there any other questions in chat? Somehow my chat is not working well. Daniel, you want to take over again?
Sure. David, there are three more questions by students. So
I see lots of questions here in the chat. Yeah.
But I can read them to there.
Yep.
There are three that I haven't read. So if we I'll read
Okay.
them and you can get, I think, to them.
Sure, maybe one at a time.
Yeah. So the first one, T Houseman asked, doesn't the choice of using Vulcans and zombies affect how people who are familiar with each outside of a philosophical context feel about the hypotheticals? Since Vulcans are typically the good guys, while zombies are almost always an antagonistic force.
Wow, that is a great point. I hadn't thought about this, but you're totally right. Maybe I'm somehow tipping the scales in my choice of labels for these beings, because zombies are always usually thought of as the bad guys, and Vulcans are pretty usually on the good side. I guess there are some bad Vulcans here and there, but no, that's a good point. And so if we did experimental philosophy on this, I think if we actually tried to run this experiment to get people's judgments, I guess the very first lesson of this would be, okay, don't use the word Vulcan and don't use the word zombie in raising the thought experiment, because that may bias people's responses. Yeah, and I may already have unwittingly biased your responses by using the words Vulcan and zombie. So if we were doing this properly and objectively, I should not use these colorful labels, but just stipulate the cases. Call the zombie, I don't know, Keith Campbell once used the phrase imitation man for zombie, imitation person. I don't know, maybe that's still evaluatively neutral. Or for the Vulcan, we could use, I don't know, anhedonic, asymbolic. I mean, of course, that would make the talk much more boring, not to have zombies and Vulcans in there, but just these technical expressions. But probably you're right that to evaluate our moral reactions to these cases properly, we should use some more neutral language. I would like to think that if we did, my reactions would still be much the same, and hopefully many of you would still have similar reactions, even if we used more neutral labels. But that's exactly the kind of thing that people who do experimental philosophy can study. And I hope that maybe somebody will. Somebody criticized actually my use of the zombie language in the case of consciousness in a recent paper, saying that the word zombie was biased against these beings to make us think they're not conscious. And I said, well, yeah, that's the whole point. By definition, zombies are not conscious. So I didn't think that was necessarily a problem in that context. But in this context, where their moral status is substantively at issue, you may well be right that it can be biasing, and that should be something we're careful of.
Okay, thank you. Chiara Vasquez asked, weren't all of us at some point unconscious beings, fetuses, that later attained consciousness?
Yeah, of course, the status of consciousness in fetuses is difficult and complicated. If you're there are panpsychists out there who think that everything in the world is conscious. There are also people, biopsychists, who think that every living organism, even say single-celled organisms, are conscious. If that's your view, then maybe we were never unconscious beings, because any living being has some degree of consciousness. But if you take the orthodox view that consciousness kicks in at some level of complexity, I think most people will say that that at least at some point in development, fetuses are not conscious, and yeah, what happens later on is complicated and argued about. Then I guess the question is, were we ever fetuses? And that's a difficult question and personal identity that a lot of people argue over. Connects to questions as to whether we're essentially people and whether fetuses are people. I think it's very common to hold, I think, the fetuses are not people, but we're essentially people. So the fetus was not actually me. If that was the case, then I was never an unconscious fetus. On the other hand, you know, the view is certainly out there that for a long time it was held that when we were born, for a long time it was widely held that newborn babies are not conscious. I think that view is widely rejected these days. Actually, my partner, Claudia Passos Ferreira, works on this issue, and she argues very strongly that newborn infants are conscious. But just say you think that a newborn infant is not conscious, then you may well hold that that each of us was at some point a newborn infant, and therefore each of us was at some point a being that had never been conscious. And some people might extend that to at least late stage fetuses and so on. So I think it's at least possible that we're unconscious beings. I think maybe one thing people would say is that we were always essentially beings with the capacity for consciousness. So even if you think a newborn baby is not conscious, you might well say a newborn baby somehow has the capacity for consciousness in a way that, you know, a coffee cup or something doesn't. And that gives newborn babies moral status. But yeah, the interaction here between consciousness and morality, especially in the cases of infants and fetuses, is of course extremely difficult and fraught area that, I don't really have settled views on.
Okay, you implicitly already answered Andrew Howell's question, which was the third one. So I think Robert can ask the next question.
Yeah, go ahead, Robert.
Thanks, David. Thank you for such a wonderful talk. So it looks, arguably moral status is multiply realizable. Lots of things can realize moral status, so affective consciousness can, and regular consciousness can, and phenomenal consciousness, self-consciousness. And the second thing I was going to say is, and oftentimes in like moral matters, what we really are concerned with is what's sufficient for moral status, not what's required. I mean, that is an interesting question, but oftentimes we're interested in, does the creature have what it takes to have moral status? And there may be a lot of things that are sufficient for it. So what about the idea that, effective phenomenal consciousness is one thing that's sufficient for moral status, and so is just regular phenomenal consciousness without effective consciousness. And there might be other types of consciousness too that are sufficient for moral status.
Yeah, sufficiency is interesting, and I guess I am sympathetic with the view that affective consciousness is sufficient for moral status. So I think it's plausible to me that any kind of affective consciousness makes your life better or worse, and having your life be better or worse is plausibly a kind of, or at least sufficient for a kind of moral status. It gets tricky with, maybe, I mentioned earlier, sensory phenomenal consciousness or perceptual phenomenal consciousness. It's less, I guess to me, it seems plausible that affective consciousness is sufficient for moral status. It's also plausible to me that cognitive consciousness is sufficient for moral status. And I think it's something like that, actually, that undergirds my intuitions about the Vulcan, that they have cognitive consciousness, they can consciously think and reason, and so they have moral status. But sensory and perceptual consciousness, I guess less obvious to me. If a being just has some element of visual consciousness, some basic awareness of light and dark, I don't know, does that give them moral status? I guess my intuition is probably less obviously than affective consciousness and cognitive consciousness, but maybe to some extent. So that's a question about the sufficiency of different states of consciousness that's less obvious to me. I was mostly on the only if half, so the necessity question, where it seems fairly clear to me that affective consciousness is not necessary for phenomenal consciousness, and arguable that consciousness is necessary. But yeah, I didn't really get into the sufficiency, let alone necessity and sufficiency. I don't know if I answered your question about sufficiency.
Well, the second part was that, so when we're concerned with like practical moral questions, should we be vegetarians or should we not? You're comparing two types of conscious creatures. Now you could say, well, they have different types of consciousness. Maybe this one has affective consciousness, but no higher order consciousness, no conscious thoughts. And, the fact that it has the affective phenomenal consciousness is sufficient for moral status. So you could have two creatures that maybe are the same in moral status. They have the same value because they have consciousness of one type or another. But then there are other things that matter to determine whether that life is maybe more important in some respect than another, but not moral status. They could just be like, moral status is one type of value. It can be realized in all sorts of different consciousness. But then, practical ethical questions usually come about when we're looking at these cases like trolley car cases where, we're comparing our lives to, say, the lives of animals, and we want to know how should we treat them? Should we treat them like we treat humans? And does the fact that they have different kinds of consciousness from us matter? And I think you could say, yeah, it does, even though we and animals have the same moral status because we have one type of consciousness or other, but we might matter more because we have, a variety of different things that might make us more valuable in one respect than the other, even though we have equal moral status.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I do think you shouldn't think of moral status just as a binary thing. That seems right. That animals have moral status, we have moral status. In the binary sense of moral status, you might say, oh, we both have moral status. I'm inclined to say we and animals probably have a different kind of moral status in virtue, for example, of differences in our consciousness. For example, we have maybe more cognitive, rationally oriented consciousness that does actually make some moral difference. Then there's interesting questions as to whether you want to think of moral status itself as something that comes in degrees, higher and lower moral status, or maybe just different kinds. We talked earlier about pluralism, about moral status, and there may be, some basic kind that we and animals share, but some other kind that we have and that animals don't have. And I don't have strong views about that. But another relevant difference is among beings that have moral status, certainly, their lives can be better and worse.
Right.
And they can, matter more or less in those, in moral calculations. Whether a being is going to be happy in the future of an action is very morally relevant, compared to whether, say, it's going to undergo extreme suffering. And if some being is going to undergo really extreme suffering, then maybe we're going to take that morally into account more than if, say, a corresponding being is only going to undergo very mild suffering. So is that a matter of moral status exactly, or just a matter of what we may weigh in moral decisions? I think when you talked about trolley problems, there was a matter of, there are things that we weigh in moral decisions that go well beyond the moral status of the being. So I do think we have to be fine-grained here.
Thank you.
Let's go to Alex next, and then Anna.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you for this talk. It was really excellent. I enjoyed it quite a lot. So I guess my question might be very similar to Fletcher's question, in which it might touch upon this idea of fungibility. It was called, right? So I guess I'm questioning, or I'm thinking about cases where even zombies obtain, and maybe this also picks up on Anna's question about sort of obtaining moral status as opposed to having it in virtue of the kind of creatures they are. And so I'm thinking of cases where people can maybe, form friendships with things that are non-conscious. So perhaps someone grew up with a zombie not knowing they're a zombie, and they go their whole lives sharing memories and experiences, and then one day they learn they're a zombie. And then unfortunately in the same day, they have to now make this sort of trolley case problem where they have to decide between their zombie lifelong friend or 5 human beings. I think just sort of practically, that might be a very tough decision for this person, even though they might understand philosophically, let's say this person's also a philosopher, they understand philosophically that their friend won't suffer, and, you know, their friend wasn't, you know, maybe not a friend because they, you know, even though they performed certain obligations and shared certain memories together, there was nothing really just sort of phenomenally happening in the background, right? They weren't enjoying the experiences together, but they sort of share those experiences nonetheless. And maybe, you know, similar analogies can be made to people who, you know, share experiences with certain parts of nature, right? Maybe you go to a childhood park and, you know, you catch your first baseball in front of a certain tree, or you met your significant other in front of the same tree, and you sort of share memories with this very specific non-conscious entity, right? A tree. And to some degree, you would, you know, put some things at stake, right? If someone were looking to chop down this tree to build some new building or something, you would think a lot is at stake for this non-conscious entity, for its own sake, and not merely just because you feel like you'd be losing some part of your own experience or memory. So I guess I'm curious what you think about cases where, borrowing some sentiment from virtue ethics, where individuals can form genuine emotional relationships and therefore sort of attribute a kind of moral status, or attribute at least a feeling that these entities have a kind of moral status for the individual, and maybe not merely, you know, the person across seas has no stake in this sort of relationship.
Yeah, this is interesting. I mean, there's certainly at least two things that are going on in this case. Maybe this doesn't exhaust what's going on. First, at least in your case where you recently discovered that the being is a zombie, then at least for most of your life, you believed this being had moral status. And okay, well now, maybe the grounds for thinking that are gone, but it's still psychologically very natural for you to continue to attribute to this being moral status, even though it doesn't have moral status. That's one element of what can be going on. Another element is that very clearly these beings can have value to you. So the tree, at the very least, the tree is very important to me. I don't know if this counts as a intrinsic moral status. Maybe it's a relational or instrumental or something moral status, but at the very least, the tree has that. And of course, importance to oneself, even if it's like selfish, in some sense, egocentric, can nonetheless be a kind of evaluative status, even if it's not moral status. But then the question is, yeah, but maybe these relationships would go along with the idea that, yeah, it's bad to harm this being, this tree that I've spent so much time with. And the thought is, it's not just selfishly bad. It's not just bad because it would be bad for me. It's bad because it would be bad for the tree. I mean, this is something that goes with trees in general, as some might hold, and it wouldn't be something distinctive to the relational aspect. But I guess it gets interesting where you think that the relationship there between me and the tree gives the tree some intrinsic moral status. It's not merely a matter of its relation to me. That's complex. That's going to be a fine line to hone there. Maybe there's a way where you can say that somehow in some circumstances relations ground intrinsic moral statuses. I guess I'd be somewhat inclined to go for the slightly weaker view that it has a relational moral importance for you, and that also it's be very deeply as part of your moral psychology in some of these cases that it has some intrinsic moral status. But that fact about your moral psychology doesn't entail that it actually has that moral status.
Yeah, and I think this is sort of, you know, your explanation was super helpful, and I think it brings out the intuition that I had, which is there seems to be a presupposition, namely that we're only justified in attributing moral status to creatures if we think that they're somehow we only sort of attribute moral status to creatures if we think that they somehow embody moral status to begin with. So it looks like we're only justified in attributing moral status if, in virtue of the kind of creature they are, they have it. But maybe there is some sort of story you can tell, as you were describing, with relational sort of engagement with people, where we're actually justified in attributing moral status to creatures, even in cases where the creature doesn't have it in virtue of, you know, their nature, so to speak. But that's super helpful. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Anna.
I'm sorry for double dipping. I really want to think about moral status a little bit more. So is moral status something that someone has, that one is, or is it a kind of treatment that one's existence kind of morally necessitates from others? So, and if any of those are true, is moral status different from the concept of, for example, personhood, right? In a way that we now talk about attributing personhood to some great apes or to some AI, some future AI that might, for example, pass the Turing test convincingly. So what is this moral status? I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, personhood is itself a complex and ambiguous notion, but I do think it's at least natural for people to understand personhood in a way that ties to full moral status. Anything which is a person has full moral status, at least the kind that humans have, whereas things that are not persons may have partial moral status, but not full moral status. So for example, a non-human animal might have I think standardly people use the word person so that they say non-human animals are not persons, although they may still be individuals with minds. And they may have some moral status, but not full moral status. So I think those two at least naturally go together. I don't know to what extent that's a definitional claim, that it's just a person is by definition something with full moral status, or rather we have some substantive concept of a person as maybe, I don't know, being with a certain degree of consciousness and rationality, such that having that suffices for full moral status. But there's certainly connections there. And again, on the question of whether it's a status you have in your own right, sort of objectively, or whether it's a matter of how you're treated, well, both phenomena exist. There's having a certain moral status, and there's being treated as if you have that moral status, and those can come radically apart. There's this whole phenomenon of dehumanization, where many people are treated as if they're not humans, or some people put it as if they're not persons. So then from the treatment aspect, then they're not being treated as if they have moral status. But I think most people would say this kind of dehumanization is wrong, monstrous, partly because in fact these beings are persons and they do have moral status. So at least in these cases, we strongly distinguish being a person from being treated as a person. And I guess I'm inclined to say the same about moral status, that we ought to distinguish having a moral status from being treated as if you have moral status. So they're both very real phenomena.
Matt, you have the last question for the day.
Oh my. Oh, great. Thank you. Great talk again. Thanks so much. I think we all are really grateful for you giving this talk. So I just wanted to, I shared your concerns about effective sentientism, I think you called it. But the argument against Vulcans don't matter. I thought one part of it was too quick, and I want to make sure that I understood it, or if this might be something you might have a response to. So the dilemma on that slide was, right, so you posed the idea of, well, there's a being with tiny positive and negative valence, and then you said, well, one point of the dilemma is, right, suppose we say that that person with tiny valence does matter, a tiny amount of effective capacity, then we say, how can this tiny difference be the difference between the Vulcans and the humans? So I'm going to take the second horn and say, let's imagine we take the second horn, right, arguendo, and say, they matter a fraction as much as humans do. I haven't said which fraction, of course. Fraction suggests a very small amount. But so then you say, then people with, this implies then, people with wide effective range matter more than people with narrow effective range, and that this could be a monstrous result. And I think that was the thing I want to take issue with, right? So it could be that for a whole range of questions, it wouldn't affect our decision-making, whom to save, right? So if two people are drowning, one person is like a great appreciator of art, has this great effective range, right? And another person is more narrow, like doesn't like art at all. We wouldn't say, well, we should save the person from drowning because they appreciate art. But it could be that for some questions, at least, they would get greater consideration. Like if you're deciding, I don't know, if someone has a gun to your head and says, hit one person's hand with a hammer, right? Well, then you'd better hit the person's hand with the hammer who feels more pain than less, right? So I just thought another just curlicue on that is that you could grant that they matter for some questions, they could be given less consideration than a person with full effective range, but that past a certain threshold, people should basically be treated equally, right? So once you have the core affective capacities, let's say, you're able to feel pain to a reasonable level, you're able to appreciate the fact that you exist and so on, that then past that threshold, everything is similar. So I just thought that argument against Vulcans didn't matter. Just that little part was too quick, and I wanted to see what you thought about that.
That's all really interesting. I guess I agree that it seems clear that width of affective range can sometimes matter in moral decision making, and in particular, I think I mentioned the case of extreme, someone with the capacity for extreme suffering. If doing something unpleasant is going to cause one person extreme suffering, it's going to cause another person just very mild suffering, then I think there's a strong moral case for doing it to the someone has to undergo it, and the person then make it the person who has only mild suffering. I guess I was focusing on the kinds of moral status that goes along with questions like, is it okay to kill them? Which, as you said earlier, is only one kind of moral status, but it seems one that's very relevant here. And if it turns out that your view says it's totally okay to kill a being who has zero affective range, but it's absolutely monstrous to kill a being that has a tiny affective range, then that at least seems to be something that needs explained. It looks kind of counterintuitive. It's a tiny difference making a huge moral difference. And yeah, I think there's a reasonable question about how that's possible. And that's consistent with it, there being other things for which this difference is quite relevant. Although I'd still be interested in the case of the degrees of suffering. It does look like that's more of a degreed case, and maybe in that case you wouldn't get the huge difference in moral status, but you'd get small differences in moral status with the small effective range. Then you raise the question of thresholds, and I do agree that, I mean, maybe the right view here is not so much a linear increase in affect, increase in conscious, increase in moral status, but up to a certain, maybe there are steps. Once you get to sensory consciousness, it gives you this. Once you get some affect, it gives you that. Once you get cognitive consciousness, maybe it gives you more. I mean, someone could raise some of these questions about my own view. Beings with a little bit of capacity for reasoning and a whole lot more, and so on. So I do think that probably a subtle treatment of this matter would allow for the possibility of thresholds. I still think you're going to get that dilemma for the moral state. Is it okay to kill someone with very narrow effective range? I mean, okay, I think if you end up saying, yes, it's okay to kill a being with zero effective range, but no, it's not okay to kill a being with narrow effective range, then I'm really going to want to see how this, you could say, what's the threshold? You pass the threshold of having affect. And so now it's no longer okay to kill you. I still want to see how it is that threshold could make such a huge moral difference. But maybe there's some story someone could tell.
Thanks so much.
Okay, let's thank our speaker, David Chalmers, for a great talk and a great discussion.
Thanks very much for all the great questions. A whole lot to think about here. This has been very useful for me.
Yes, absolutely. It's been fun for us too. So I'm going to thank everyone for coming to this Sprague and Taylor lecture this year. And I know that Dave Chalmers has to go. He's actually in LA right now. So we're probably very jet lagged. So let's thank him again. And
Peter Singer, who we mentioned during the talk, is about to be awarded the Berggruen Prize.
That's right. So you might ask him about his lecture at Brooklyn College. That was before my time. That was before I was hired here. But he might remember when he came to Brooklyn College, and I don't know what he spoke on. Presumably something to do with ethics.
I'll ask him tonight and get back to you.
Yep, absolutely. Do let me know. And we'll be in touch. Otherwise, I hope to see you in the fall. And the college will send you a check for the honorarium.
Cool.
So that'll come.
I would have talked for free.
Oh, that's what real philosophers do. They do it for the love of discourse, not the love of money. I think you should tell all philosophers that.
Very good. Well, thanks so much, Simon. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks again. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.
Thanks again. Take care.